Welcome to Life Stories, where we share heartwarming tales of love, loss, and the unexpected moments that change our lives forever. Today, we bring you the story of Ethan, a successful CEO whose life takes an unexpected turn after a tragic accident. Struggling with isolation and loss, Ethan's world seems empty until a chance encounter with a young boy and his mother. Someone from his past. What happens next will make you believe in second chances and the power of new beginnings. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey with us. Ethan Carter had it all, or so it seemed. A successful career, a reputation as one of the brightest tech geniuses of his generation, and a future that appeared bright and full of promise. He was the CEO of a thriving tech empire, respected by colleagues and admired by competitors. People looked up to him not only for his intellect but also for his drive, his ambition, and his ability to create something monumental from nothing. But in the blink of an eye, that perfect world came crashing down. It was a day like any other when the accident occurred. The kind of day Ethan would later wish he had never seen. He was driving down the familiar road, heading to yet another meeting, consumed by thoughts of business strategies, potential acquisitions, and the pressure of maintaining his empire. His mind was elsewhere, his attention divided, and then, in an instant, everything changed. The sound of screeching tires, the jarring impact, the sharp pain, and then, silence. When Ethan opened his eyes, he was no longer in control. He could see, he could hear, but he couldn't move. His legs, once strong and capable, were no longer his own. A tragic car accident had left him paralyzed from the waist down. The doctors said it was a miracle he had survived at all. But to Ethan, it didn't feel like a miracle. It felt like a nightmare. The pain, both physical and emotional, was overwhelming. His body, once his greatest asset, had betrayed him. He had spent years pushing himself to the limit, never considering the consequences of his relentless pursuit of success. And now, in a single, cruel moment, he was forced to face the reality of his limitations. But it wasn't just the loss of physical ability that tore him apart. It was the sense of profound loss that came with it. Ethan had always defined himself by his achievements. His worth had always been tied to his career, to his power, to his position in the world. And now, with all of that gone, who was he? The worst part was the isolation. As the days passed, Ethan found himself alone, trapped in a body that no longer worked the way it once had. The world outside continued, but he was stuck in a bubble of self-pity and despair. The only company he had were the sterile walls of his hospital room and the occasional visit from his parents, who tried their best to comfort him. But it felt hollow. They didn't understand. No one did. Then there was Sarah, the woman he had once planned to marry. Ethan had loved her with a passion he had never known before. She was his everything, the person he had imagined spending the rest of his life with. But as soon as the accident happened, everything changed. She tried to be there for him, to reassure him that nothing had changed, that they could still build a life together. But Ethan couldn't see it. In his mind, he was no longer the man he once was. He had become a burden. He pushed her away, thinking it was for her own good. He convinced himself that she deserved someone better, someone whole. So, he withdrew from her, retreating further into his own sorrow. He didn't want her pity, and he couldn't bear the thought of her watching him crumble. He had to protect her from the man he had become. It wasn't long before Sarah, heartbroken and exhausted from trying to reach him, made the painful decision to walk away. The love they once shared faded into the past, leaving behind only the memories of what could have been. In the years that followed, Ethan threw himself into his work. It became the only thing that made him feel alive, the only thing that could fill the emptiness that had consumed him. He built his company into one of the most successful tech empires in the world. He became a billionaire, admired by his peers, respected by his employees, and envied by others. But despite all of this, he felt more alone than ever. Money, success, and accolades, they were hollow. None of it could fill the void that had grown inside him. He had everything he had ever dreamed of, but nothing that truly mattered. The more he achieved, the emptier he felt. Ethan became a prisoner of his own success. He lived in a bubble, avoiding social events and interactions with anyone outside of work. The people around him were just faces, shadows in the background of his mechanical existence. He found solace only in his office, late into the night, where he could bury himself in the work that had come to define him. But deep down, there was a yearning, a longing for something more. He wanted to feel something real again. He wanted to be seen, to be loved, but he didn't know how to find it. He didn't even know if he deserved it. Little did Ethan know, everything was about to change in the most unexpected way. And it would begin with a small act of kindness. One that would challenge everything he had come to believe about himself and the life he had built. The days in Ethan's world blurred together, each one indistinguishable from the next. He found himself caught in a cycle of work, solitude, and an overwhelming sense of emptiness. The walls of his office became his sanctuary, where he could hide from the world outside. But even in the midst of his achievements, there was an undeniable void, a quiet ache that gnawed at him, refusing to be ignored. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ethan was standing outside his office building, waiting for his driver. The weight of the day pressed down on him as his mind wandered to the next project, the next challenge. The moment was mundane, a fleeting part of his routine. But something small and unexpected happened that changed everything. Ethan's phone, which he had been holding on his lap, slipped and fell to the pavement. He reached for it instinctively, but as his hand hovered above it, he was reminded of the limitations his body now imposed. His fingers couldn't grasp the phone, and frustration bubbled up inside him. He stared at the phone on the ground, willing himself to bend forward, to just make the connection. But the effort was in vain. The weight of his paralysis hit him again, like a punch to the gut. Just as he was about to give up, a small voice broke through his thoughts. "I can get it for you, mister." Ethan looked up, surprised. Standing before him was a young boy, no older than 6, with bright blonde hair and an eager smile. The child, despite Ethan's imposing presence, didn't seem the least bit intimidated. Without hesitation, the boy bent down, picked up the phone, and handed it to Ethan. Ethan took the phone from the boy, momentarily stunned. The simple act of kindness, so genuine and unaffected, caught him off guard. It was just a phone, just a small gesture, but in that moment, it felt like something much more profound. Ethan could almost feel a small, hesitant light flickering in the darkness that had surrounded him for so long. Before he could say anything, the boy's voice rang out again, louder now. "Mom, come here." Ethan's heart stopped. That voice, he knew it. It had been years, but the sound of it still echoed in his memory. A flood of emotions rushed through him, catching him completely off guard. He turned slowly, his eyes searching for the source. And then, standing a few feet away, he saw her, Sarah, the woman he had never stopped loving, the woman he had pushed away, the woman he had abandoned. The years had passed, but seeing her again felt like no time had passed at all. She hadn't changed much. Her chestnut hair was still styled in soft waves. Her eyes still held that warmth that Ethan had once taken for granted. But there was something different about her now, a quiet strength, a guardedness in her expression that hadn't been there before. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, both frozen in time. Ethan's heart raced, and his thoughts were a whirlwind of memories, of what had been and what could have been. But the reality of their years apart, the pain of what had happened, stood like a wall between them. Neither knew what to say, how to bridge the gap that had formed in the wake of their broken relationship. Max, completely unaware of the tension between them, looked up at his mother and beamed. "Mommy, this nice man dropped his phone and I helped him." He turned back to Ethan, grinning ear to ear. "Do you want to get ice cream with us?" Ethan, still in shock, hesitated. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face Sarah, to confront the years of pain and regret he had buried deep inside. But as he looked down at Max's innocent face, something stirred within him, a feeling he hadn't had in years. A connection, a glimmer of hope. He met Sarah's gaze, and for a moment, they both seemed to read each other's thoughts. It was clear that neither of them knew what to do. But Sarah sighed and nodded softly. "All right," she said quietly. "Let's go." As they walked toward the ice cream shop, Ethan tried to collect himself. He kept his eyes trained on the sidewalk, feeling the weight of the silence between them. Max, however, chattered away, oblivious to the complexities of the situation. He spoke about his favorite ice cream flavors and his adventures at school. His enthusiasm infectious, and slowly, despite his own reservations, Ethan began to relax. The walls he had built around himself, the walls he had thought would never come down, started to feel a little less insurmountable. They reached the ice cream shop, and Max practically dragged Ethan inside. Despite his initial reluctance, Ethan found himself smiling, even laughing a little at Max's antics. It was hard not to be drawn in by the boy's energy. His pure, untainted joy. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a flicker of something that wasn't emptiness or sorrow. As they sat at the table, Max excitedly declared his love for strawberry ice cream, while Sarah mentioned that chocolate was her favorite. Ethan chuckled and, almost without thinking, answered, "Chocolate." "Actually." Sarah raised an eyebrow in surprise. "You always liked vanilla before," she said, her voice soft with a hint of surprise. Ethan paused for a moment, looking at her. His mind swirled with memories of their time together. The quiet nights they had spent talking, dreaming of the future. He gave a small smile and replied, "A lot has changed." Sarah nodded slowly, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to settle into something more familiar. They hadn't spoken in years. Yet in that moment, it felt as though they were just two people trying to find their way back to something they had once known. The afternoon wore on quietly, as the three of them sat in the small ice cream shop, sharing a simple, unremarkable moment that somehow felt monumental. Max was happily talking about his latest fascination with space, as kids often do, dreaming of becoming an astronaut, of flying among the stars. Ethan listened with a soft smile, intrigued by the innocence and optimism of the boy. It was hard not to be drawn in by his energy, the kind of energy Ethan had lost touch with years ago. For a moment, it was as though the weight of the years, the loss, and the grief hadn't existed. The world around him seemed less heavy, and the silence between him and Sarah was less charged. It was a quiet, tentative peace, and for Ethan, it was the first real breath of air he had taken in years. As they finished their ice creams, Sarah and Ethan exchanged quiet glances. The years had changed them both in ways they hadn't expected. Yet here they were, sitting together, sharing a moment that felt like the beginning of something new. It wasn't just about the ice cream or the passing of time, it was the possibility of what could come next. Something they both hadn't dared to think about until now. After the ice cream, Max tugged on Ethan's sleeve, his bright blue eyes shining with excitement. "Can you push me on the swing, mister?" he asked eagerly. Ethan hesitated, his mind flashing back to the limitations of his wheelchair. He knew he couldn't do it in the way Max would probably want. But there was something about the boy's request that stirred a deep, unspoken desire in Ethan. He wanted to be more than just a bystander in life. He wanted to make a difference, even if only for a moment. "I can try," Ethan said, with a small but sincere smile. Max beamed in response and ran ahead toward the swing set, with Sarah and Ethan following behind. Emily helped Max onto the swing, and as he began to rock back and forth, Ethan used his hands to give him gentle pushes. Each motion, no matter how small, brought a sense of joy that Ethan hadn't felt in years. Max's laughter filled the air, pure and unburdened, and for the first time since the accident, Ethan felt a sense of pride in himself. Pride in being able to make a difference in someone's life, even in such a small way. As they watched Max kick his legs, laughing, Sarah turned to Ethan. There was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a kind of understanding that spoke volumes. She smiled, her voice light as she teased, "You're going to tire him out." Ethan chuckled, his smile wide and genuine for the first time in a long while. "That's the plan." The moment was simple, But it was a turning point. In the presence of Max's innocence and Sarah's quiet strength, Ethan began to see a new path unfolding before him. His world, once defined by loneliness and isolation, was now filled with possibilities he had never considered before. He was no longer just a man in a wheelchair, locked in a solitary existence. He was part of something, of a family, of a shared experience, of a life that still had the potential to offer more than just the cold achievements of success. As they sat on a park bench, watching Max play on the jungle gym, the silence between Ethan and Sarah grew comfortable. It was heavy, yes, but not in the same way it had been before. It was filled with unspoken words. The kind of words that had been buried for years but were finally beginning to rise to the surface. Ethan turned to Sarah, his voice soft. "He's a great kid," he said sincerely. Sarah's eyes softened as she looked at her son. "He is. He's my whole world," she replied, her voice carrying a quiet strength. There was a long pause before Ethan finally spoke again. The question that had been on his mind since they'd met earlier that afternoon. "Is his father?" Sarah sighed, looking down for a moment. "He passed away when Max was a baby. It's just been the two of us ever since." Ethan's heart ached, not just for Sarah's loss, but for the life she had lived without him. He had been absent from her life, from Max's life, and it hurt in a way he hadn't expected. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his words sincere. Sarah looked up at him, her gaze unreadable. "A lot has changed, Ethan, but some things feel like they never really left." Ethan's chest tightened at her words. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was still a chance for him, for Sarah, for them to find something new together. Something that wasn't defined by the past, but by the possibility of a future that they could build, slowly, carefully, but surely. As they continued to watch Max play, Ethan couldn't help but feel that, somehow, this was the beginning of something important. Something that could change everything. The road ahead was uncertain. They both knew that, but for the first time, they were both willing to take the next step forward, together. As the day drew to a close, the three of them sat together on a park bench, watching Max run around the playground with boundless energy. Ethan felt a warmth in his heart that he hadn't known in years. The world around him had changed in ways he hadn't expected. And yet, in this moment, it felt like everything had finally come full circle. The weight of the past, the mistakes he had made, and the isolation he had chosen to endure, didn't seem as heavy now. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just going through the motions of life, he was truly living. Turning to Sarah, he felt a sense of quiet understanding between them. They both knew the road ahead would be challenging, filled with uncertainties and unspoken emotions. But there was hope now. Hope that they could rebuild what had been lost. Or at least start something new. It wasn't going to be easy, but they were willing to try. And that, in itself, was enough. Max ran up to them, out of breath but with a bright smile, and said, "Can we do this again sometime?" Ethan smiled down at the boy. "I'd like that," he replied. As they made their way home, the three of them, walking side by side, Ethan couldn't help but feel that, after all these years of running from the past, it was time to stop. Maybe it wasn't too late for him to find happiness, to find love again, and perhaps, just perhaps, this small family he had reconnected with could be the key to healing the wounds he had carried for so long. Thank you for joining us in this heartwarming story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more amazing life stories. See you in the next video.